Hi everyone, my name is Javeria Jaffrey and I've prepared a short video resource to discuss finance and development with you. There are three objectives to this resource. One is to acknowledge that in economics, development is construed as a problem to be addressed through capital accumulation and investment. The second objective is to appreciate the broad debates about the role of finance in development. And the third objective is to identify the key economic theories and the thinkers that have contributed to these debates. How do we frame these debates? We can use one question, which is how can developing countries grow investment and accumulate capital? And there are two perspectives that are very useful for understanding how we might go about addressing this question. So, one of these perspectives is the FFD view, that stands for Finance for Development. And the other perspective is the political economy view. So, let's discuss the FFD view a little bit. This is also sometimes described as a mainstream view. And scholars who subscribe to this view advocate privatization, liberalization, and deregulation. And increasingly now, there's an emphasis on fixing bad institutions. Scholars of the political economy view place an emphasis on managing financial markets. And scholars of the more radical stream of this view place an emphasis on dismantling the market economy. Now, these views can also be described as either falling into a heterodox or an orthodox perspective. The orthodox perspective sees finance and money as having a passive role in the economy, and they also see economies as self equilibrating, whereas scholars of the heterodox view see finance and money as actively shaping the economy in contrast to passively. And they also see economies as prone to disequilibria. So, this is reflected in events such as crises and in gluts and in the persistence of inequality. Now, to discuss the relationship between finance and development, we need to know a little more about investment. How can developing countries grow investment and accumulate capital? The classic view in the context of development is that development occurs through savings and investment. So, because of that, there's a need to address traps. So, for instance, the poverty trap. Poverty traps depress productivity and savings. As a result, capital accumulation will be low. The other aspect of the classic view is that capital investment and also trade gaps occur because of shortages in savings and investment. So, poor countries face constraints in accessing finance from a variety of sources. So, they have problems when they seek to gain finance from production, from trade, from taxation, from domestic investment and savings, for instance. How can we grow investment? The core assumption in the earlier studies of development is that low investment is caused by low savings. So Roy Harrod's model and FZ Domar's model are very relevant over here, and they're behind what came to be known as the Harrod-Domar model. This places an emphasis on capital because it is a lack of capital and not the lack of labor that constrains growth. The Harrod Domar model also places an emphasis on the potential in an economy for instability rather than equilibrium. So, because the wrong growth rate can result in either a shortage or surplus of capital, it's important to make a distinction between what we know as warranted or um, actual growth rates, which are distinct concepts. Now, this model has been heavily critiqued for rigid and unrealistic assumptions. These include a fixed capital labor and fixed capital output ratio. And the second aspect of the critique is that it doesn't allow for technology and changes in productivity. This has nevertheless been very influential, and this is primarily because it was adopted heavily by international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. Now, subsequent work in development economics, such as that of Rosenstein Rodan in the 1940s, Nursky in the 1950s, and also Rostow in the 1960s, continued to expand on this idea that capital investment in the form of a big push was essential to place poor countries on a trajectory of high growth. Let's discuss some perspectives on finance. So, we can, as I mentioned before, make a distinction between orthodox views on finance and heterodox views on finance. What is the orthodoxy? To fully understand this, we need to draw upon what is sometimes described as a neoclassical counter revolution. So, in the 1980s, a neoclassical, and sometimes this is called a neoliberal counter revolution in development theory and policy, reasserted dominance over structuralist and other schools of thought in much of the world. The emergence of this counter revolution coincided with the abandonment by the developed countries of social democratic and Keynesian economic policies and the policy of controlling capital movements, as well as the post World War II trading regime. As a result, Economic policies reflected skepticism and even antagonism around government intervention in the economy. This contrasts with the Harrod Domar model, which provided a case for government intervention. It's also very important for us to understand the marginal revolution in the context of all of this. So, classical political economists, and by that I mean scholars like Adam Smith, Jean Baptiste Say, David Ricardo, they saw capital accumulation as the mechanism through which economies transform. Neoclassical economists, on the other hand, see individual choices as the mechanism through which economies transform. Now, this shift can be attributed to the marginal revolution. The marginal revolution reflects the work of marginalists. So these marginalists include scholars like Wallerau and Jevons. The focus of economic analysis in their work shifts to micro concerns over macro concerns. For instance, scarcity and exchange instead of production and value. In the 1950s, Arrow and DeBrew showed how competitive markets maximize utility because under perfect competition, demand equals supply. Now, this made the case for more markets and wider and deeper markets. The key message over here is that everything should be traded because assets that are priced will send signals to the economy as a whole via financial markets, and this improves aggregate welfare. So, as a result, even goods that were not previously traded, such as water, energy, carbon, and mortgages, should be assigned prices through the financial market. And in subsequent parts of this video resource, I will discuss how these tendencies are linked to what we describe sometimes as financialization. Now, there's an emphasis in orthodox approaches now of getting prices right. So, neoclassical growth theory relies on this concept of diminishing marginal returns to capital and the substitution of labor and capital. So, not only does capital have diminishing marginal returns, labor and capital can be substituted. That's a very core aspect of neoclassical growth theory. Another aspect is that prices determine shifts in production. So, when distorted pricing is addressed, firstly, financial capital will flow into poor countries. And secondly, poor countries should grow faster than rich countries. So, there's this notion of convergence. In endogenous growth theory, so endogenous growth theory can be contrasted with neoclassical growth theory. In endogenous growth theory, growth is the outcome of internal processes such as technology, innovation, and investment rather than exogenous forces, and this challenges the view of neoclassical economics. So productivity through this lens can rise even when capital is subject to diminishing returns, and free competitive markets allocate capital to its best uses. Technology and knowledge transfer are also very important in endogenous growth theories. They're important because foreign investment um, in this set of views must be facilitated through financial liberalization. So, this is how technology and knowledge transfer have been incorporated into contemporary development policy. Aside from getting prices right, there is also an emphasis in orthodox approaches of getting markets right. So, the schools of thought that place a very heavy emphasis on getting markets right include the NIE, the New Institutional Economics stream, and that acknowledges the failures of the Washington Consensus and also the policies and successes of the East Asian miracle economies. So, in this, there's an emphasis on institutions such as investor protection, property rights, rule of law, transparent accounting standards, and so on. And financial regulation is also emphasized because without financial regulation, markets can fail. So there is this acceptance of the idea that markets are prone to failure. There's also a new structural economics perspective, which also seeks to get markets right. And this emerges from the World Bank because of the work primarily of Justin Lin over the previous decade. So, government intervention in this approach is needed to solve coordination problems, particularly as countries move from agrarian to industrial structures. And governments also need to identify industries for their comparative advantage. So, aside from orthodox perspectives on finance, there is growing interest now in heterodox approaches, and this has expanded considerably since the global financial crisis of 2007 to 9. Now, heterodox scholars are particularly concerned with the orthodox assumption of convergence. Orthodox economists argue that rich and poor countries will eventually converge, but heterodox economists draw attention to the logic of accumulated advantage. And in this, inequalities are reproduced because of financial liberalization. Why does this happen? There are two reasons primarily. First, finance actively shapes the economy, and secondly, markets don't clear. Instead, they produce crises and they produce gluts. Now, both of these reasons are primarily because of the nature of money. Money is not neutral in the heterodox view of finance. Instead, it's prone to distinct patterns of accumulation. Now, given this, the economy needs to be guided and managed and also protected from the free market. In some heterodox thought, and this goes back to the concept of radical streams which seek to dismantle the market economy. This can only be achieved outside of the market. So, what are the specific approaches to heterodox development thought? We can identify quite a few of these. It's important, particularly, I think, to talk about post Keynesian economics. Now, post Keynesian economics is centered on the role of money, particularly on how precautionary and speculative motives for holding money can undo the economy. Post Keynesian economics is also associated with this concept of how investment is driven by expectations or animal spirits. So, in post Keynesian economics, the theory of loanable funds is seen as a fallacy. It's the fallacy of loanable funds. As a result of the nature of money, financial regulators must take an activist role to control the market. Another heterodox approach to development is that of the developmental state. The developmental state literature argues that government directed credit can accelerate investment and development. So sometimes government intervention should be designed not to get prices right, but instead to get prices wrong. So subsidies, for instance, can be used to support industries targeted for their development potential. Now, this approach is complicated in a globalized system, particularly because an impossible trinity of monetary independence, financial openness, exchange rate stability exists. So it's very hard to achieve objectives in all three areas, which is why the developmental state approach sort of lost traction over recent decades. Another heterodox approach, which is relevant to development, is that of critical macrofinance. This is quite a contemporary approach, and it will relate quite closely to our discussion of shadow banking, which will be held later in this video resource. So, global finance in the critical macrofinance or CMF approach, global finance is a network of balance sheets that are connected by collateral points. Most credit creation takes place through securities market, through collateral based money, and through derivative markets. This creates new patterns of power and dependency when development interventions are organized around market based finance. Now, there are also within the heterodox school of thought more radical approaches. These are called radical because they seek to dismantle the market. So, within this, we have the post development school of thought. Post development scholars see discourses and practices of development as creating the issues that they seek to resolve. They also see development as a continuation of colonial patterns of control, authority, and hierarchy. Other than post development approaches, there are also Marxian approaches which are relevant to how we see development. These are derived from the work of Karl Marx. Marx saw development as a linear process that increases productivity but relies on exploitation. As a result, it increases inequality. Marx also had quite a clear view on finance. He saw money as a commodity, and this concept is grounded in the labor theory of value. Money allows for objectified labor value to be stored, exchanged, and hidden. And another approach that falls within this radical stream of heterodox economics is dependency theory. Countries on the periphery of the world system cannot achieve development because underdevelopment is a direct function of development, according to this approach. Now, in this part of the video session, I want to have a quick discussion about financialization in the global south. For this, we need to understand what financialization is. What do we mean by financialization? Very broadly, financialization refers to the growing power of finance. Over the last few decades, primarily since the 1970s, the growth of finance is reflected in activities, in markets, institutions, and in profits. This expansion of financial power has transformed relationships between corporations, financial institutions, workers, and households. Where can we see this? What is the evidence of this? How do we know that the power of finance is growing or has grown? Now, primarily, this is reflected in the growing role of debt. This is endorsed by institutions such as pension companies, insurance companies, and so on. Pension and insurance companies buy company bonds and shares. This allows companies to borrow against future income streams. By borrowing, companies can invest in new production. Companies can also use these income streams to pay workers. Workers make purchases, therefore, from other companies. And these same workers place their savings in pension and insurance companies. So, this has been described by some scholars as the cycle of debt. Now that we know what financialization is, let's discuss specifically what financialization means for the global south. Now, to get a good understanding of how financialization has shaped the global south, or more specifically, the international dimension of financialization, it's very important to be familiar with the concept of shadow banking. This concept of shadow banking is associated with the economist Paul McCulley, who worked with PIMCO, or the Pacific Investment Management Company, in 2007 at a speech for the annual financial symposium hosted by the Kansas City Federal Reserve Bank in Wyoming. He coined the term shadow bank. Now, shadow banking is a term that's used to describe bank like activities, mainly lending, that take place outside the traditional banking sector. It's commonly referred to internationally as NBFI, non bank financial intermediation, also sometimes known as market based finance. Shadow bank lending has a similar function to traditional bank lending, but it is not regulated in the same way as traditional bank lending. The driving force for creating liquidity in the economy are traditional commercial banks. They accept the illiquid liabilities of both non financial and financial entities for their own liquid liabilities. They also have access to emergency funding from the central bank. In contrast, the shadow banking system is centered on activities that generate liquidity through capital markets without public guarantees or backstops, and they provide access to the central bank as the lender of last resort. Now, unlike traditional commercial banks, shadow banks are unregulated. They are not subject to the traditional banking regulation system. So, they can't borrow in an emergency from the central bank or from the lender of last resort. Now, to better understand shadow banking, it's necessary to draw some comparisons between traditional banks and shadow banks. Traditional banking is based on a model of intermediation. Shadow banks rely on disintermediation. So that's one key difference. A core objective of the traditional bank is to facilitate borrowers. For the securitized bank, the disintermediated bank, the focus is on investors. The traditional bank relies on deposits to create loans, and this is perhaps the most important part. The traditional bank relies on deposits to create loans, but also on funding from capital markets, particularly for day to day liquidity requirements. And we can contrast this with shadow banking because the capital market includes buyers and sellers. The traditional bank is buying and selling securities in the capital market, but the main operation is creating loans through deposits. This brings us to the alternative system. The alternative is focused on pooling and securitization. Pools of loans, so that includes mortgages, student loans, advanced lending, and so on, and an originator, so that originator could be a bank or a finance company, are put together. They're sold to a sponsor, also sometimes known as an aggregator, and that is usually a warehouse bank. So these pools are then sold to an administrator, typically a subsidiary of a large commercial or investment bank. And this creates an SPV, or a special purpose vehicle. So that's a company essentially which holds the loans in its portfolio and it issues securities on this basis. The administrator then sells the securities to an underwriter, generally an investment bank, which offers them to the public. If this sounds complicated, that's because it is. It is a complex system of shadow banking that's responsible for a large chunk of global assets. Now, to understand shadow banking in a little more depth and to draw linkages between shadow banking and financialization in the global south, it's useful to have some sense of what sort of instruments or what sort of mechanisms are used to advance shadow banking. One of these is securitized debt. Securitization is the creation of tradable securities out of illiquid loans. This means that loans are repackaged into standardized products. They can receive a credit rating and then they can be traded in secondary markets. And this is exactly what happened with the subprime crisis in the United States with mortgages. Now, the loan originators for securitized debt sell the rights to the loans to a special purpose vehicle, or SPV, and this is treated neither as a subsidiary nor affected by the insolvency of the originator. So the SPV issues a tradable asset, or even several tradable assets, tranches, and these are sold to investors. So cash flows from the underlying loans are directed to the owners of the new securities. Now, originators prefer tranching that divides the securities into different classes with different credit ratings. They can thus be sold to a broader range of investors. And tranches establish the priority of payment of principal and interest from the underlying loans. They therefore carry different interest rates. Now, for instance, an AAA rated tranche has priority of payment over mezzanine or junior tranches. Therefore, they yield a lower interest rate to match a relatively safer profile. Tranching is also important for creating new securities known as CDOs, collateralized debt obligations. Now, CDOs are structured products that purchase and pool tradable assets as opposed to illiquid loans, such as the riskier tranches of asset and mortgage backed securities, in order to issue securities that can then be repackaged. The aim is to recycle those tranches that cannot easily be sold to investors into higher rated products with the help of credit rating agencies. The other set of instruments, so aside from securitized debt, the other set of instruments are derivatives. Now, derivative markets where financial and non financial institutions can hedge risk or take additional leverage are of interest when they become a direct source of systemic risk. The most pertinent example is offered by CDS credit default swaps issued to provide insurance on CDOs prior to the global financial crisis. So, this is where our discussion of subprime mortgage comes in. The issuers of CDS provided a guarantee on the viability of collateralized debt options that were shifting risk from the subprime lender to the mortgage backed security tranche to the CDO tranche against a premium. Now, the issuance of CDS was viewed as a risk free capture of premium, since the assumption of the underlying models was that house prices would continue to increase and therefore CDOs would continue to generate cash flows even when subprime borrowers defaulted. The perception of risk free financial profits incentivize the issue what we call naked CDS. A naked CDS purchase is when you take out insurance on bonds without actually owning them. So it's basically a speculative gamble. These provided guarantees against default to institutions with no material exposure to CDOs or other underlying structured products. And US regulators regularly sanction these instruments by allowing issuers to rely on regulatory loopholes that provided exemptions from capital requirements. So that is derivatives. There's a third set of instruments which are very important, and this is repo. Now, repo is short for repurchase agreement. It's also known as an SFT, or a securities financing transaction. Now, those who deal in government securities use repos as a form of overnight borrowing. So, a dealer or other holder of government securities, for instance, T bills, will sell the securities to a lender and agree to repurchase them at an agreed future date at an agreed price. Now, repo markets play two critical functions in financialization. First, they are wholesale funding markets, so institutions can finance their securities portfolio on cheap funding terms. The mechanics are quite simple. A borrower transfers legal ownership of the securities, and this is collateral, to a lender and promises to repurchase them at maturity of the agreement. The borrower retains economic ownership of these securities, so the risk and return associated with these securities stays with the borrower. Now, the presence of collateral renders the repo loan cheaper than an unsecured loan. So the interest rate is received by the lender, and the lender can also sell those securities in case the borrower defaults. Now, the second aspect of repos, the reason why repo markets play a very crucial function in financialization is that repos are necessary for shorting securities. They allow financial institutions to borrow securities that they don't actually own. So, security financing transactions, repos, are central to financialized business models that seek financial profits from daily changes in the price of securities. Repos therefore account for a large share of global investment bank assets held for trading, and that's significantly higher than government bonds or corporate bonds. Repos are structured legally to orient shadow bankers towards the daily market value of collateral. And for borrowers and lenders, the daily market value of the security collateral is critical. The borrower does not want to leave more collateral with the lender than the cash it has borrowed, and vice versa. Now, the practice of mark to market is what allows repos to feed aggressive leverage during good times. So, when security prices go up, the borrower gets cash securities back. They can borrow more against them to buy more securities. And that drives their price up. But on the other hand, security prices can fall also. And when security prices fall, borrowers have to find on a daily basis more cash or more collateral. When this doesn't happen, you can see a fire sale. This shatters the illusion of securities market liquidity created by cyclical repo financing. Now, what does all of this have to do with development? Financialized approaches to development are embedded in a technocratic management of poverty. The core idea is that private finance can be the solution to pressing developmental concerns. So, in the first stage, and this has been pushed by the World Bank, global financial inclusion was seen as a new development paradigm. The financialization of development is based on the idea that financial inclusion would generate employment, support entrepreneurship, and increase prosperity in low income countries. And various forms of financial inclusion, from microcredit, microfinance, fintech, have been actively supported by institutions like the World Bank. So a new strategic partnership has now emerged, and this includes fintech companies, it includes philanthropic investors, international development agencies, and the objective is to monetize lending to the poor. Now, specifically in the context of fintech, taking one specific example, we can see that global finance seeks to harness a digital revolution in financial inclusion. It places an emphasis on financialized aims and business models. It profiles the poor into generators of financial assets that can eventually be securitized. This is reflected in the World Bank's Maximizing Finance for Development report. Daniela Gabor has done very interesting work on this, and the World Bank's Maximizing Finance for Development report marks a new stage in the financialization of development. The MFD, Maximizing for Finance for Development report, suggests that poor countries can no longer achieve the sustainable development goals with their own budgets. Therefore, they need donor funding. So, to mobilize this donor funding, and the estimated amount for how much is needed is approximately USD 5 trillion. So, to mobilize this amount, it's necessary that public money should leverage private finance, particularly in institutional investors. Now, this strategy essentially rebrands a previous strategy. So, in 2015, there was a billions to trillions strategy. Transforming development finance is what the World Bank described it as. And within this strategy, there is the idea that multilateral development banks, so that's MDBs, will collectively increase financial leverage via securitization to catalyze private investment. And this also speaks to the G20 strategy for crowding in private sector finance for growth and for sustainable development.